Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another edition of Books and Looks. Yes, our weekly voyage of discovery in the wonderful world of books. Books that I've been reading and interviews I've had with the authors. And today we are joined by Candice Fleming, who has written a wonderful book called The Enigma Girls. The Enigma Girls. This book is just outstanding. It's being able to be read by every age from middle school, young adult. It's a true book. It's a nonfiction book. It's about these young girls over in England during World War II who were taken to Bletchley Park and who were eventually the codebreakers. Yeah, remember we had a fictional book a few weeks ago about by Katie Alden? Well, now we got the real thing. We got the real book here about these young girls, 17, 15, 14-year-old girls breaking the Nazi codes before the computer was around. Yeah, this is an amazing, amazing book. And boy, does Candice do a great job of explaining this. There are pictures in the books. I'll tell you what, I'm 70 years old, okay? And I learned so much from this book that I did not know. I didn't know that all the different branches of the German military had their own Enigma machines. No, I never knew that. I never knew how almost on every few months they kept updating the Enigma machine, making it more difficult. I never knew that. I never knew this embarrassing story about the Italian Navy. You gotta wait to the end of the interview to hear about that, because I'm going to tell you what, that's an embarrassment of the Italian naval. But anyway, this is a wonderful book. You'll learn a lot of things about this. This is something, you know what? You want to get this for maybe for your children, your grandchildren, nieces, nephews, friends. This is a great book. Okay? You're going to read my reviews on viewsonbooks.com, but you want to listen to this interview with the author, Candice Fleming, because she is a wonderful person, written many, many books, and you're going to really enjoy her. So without any further ado, let's go to Candice Fleming. Candice, welcome to Books and Looks.
Thanks, Blaine. I'm happy to be here.
Well, it's taken a while, but we have persevered. We've gone through allergy season, massive storms up where you're located in the Chicago area, and finally we get together, and I'm so happy.
Me too. Finally here. Yeah.
Finally. Now, before we get started with the book, I like to get a little bit of the background about you. Where are you from? Where did you go to school? Did you take creative writing classes or interested in history class? A little bit about yourself, please.
You know what? I grew up in northern Indiana, just outside Chicago, which is where I live now. And then in fourth grade, we moved to Central Illinois. My father got a job there, and that's where I grew up. And that's where I went to Eastern Illinois University, the university that was in my hometown. And I studied American history. That's what I majored in. Creative writing? No. I took a couple of classes, creative writing classes in college, electives, right? Just to get a few college credits. Loved them, but never thought that I would actually be a writer as, a life goal. It wasn't a career that I actually chose. I sort of backed into it.
Okay. So you didn't want to be an author. What made you become one?
I was working full time and I was married, and my second son was born, and he had a heart defect that he's fine now. But at the time, he couldn't go to preschool or daycare because he would get sick. And even if he got a cold, he'd end up in the hospital, which meant that there was no place for him but, to stay home. And I stayed home with him. But when I got there, at home, I realized that I just needed something for myself. I loved being home with my kids, but I just needed something. And I thought, what can I do from home? And of course, this is in, the early 2000s. So people weren't really working at home at the time. But I thought, what can I do at home? And I thought, well, I think I can write. And it was something I had always done. I just didn't think of it as a career. And so I ended up writing for magazines like American Baby and Parenting. Parents magazine. I ended up writing basically my life, right? So I wrote exciting things like 7 nap time strategies. That's mine. So, but I think of it as my apprenticeship now, because I learned to write for an editor. I learned to write to a deadline. I learned to write within the parameters of what was expected, word count, and that sort of thing. So I learned a lot doing that.
Now, I took a look at your website, and then I went on Goodreads to also check things out. I started counting. I got to around 60. I said, how many books does this lady have? Is it true you've written 60 books already?
Oh, Blaine, I'm not even sure. Isn't this something? I'm not even sure. I've stopped counting. It might be 60, um, maybe around that. Some of those are picture books, of course, so they're a little shorter projects, at least for me. But it might be close to 60, and I know I have a lot more coming in the next couple of years. So yes, I do a lot of writing.
Do you remember your first book?
Yeah, my very first published book, first published book, right? Because I could tell you my first book was in 5th grade, but no one published it, of course. But my first published book was a book called Madame Legrand and Her So High to the Sky Boreas Pompadour. It was published by Knopf. It was the first book I ever worked with my editor, Ann Schwartz, and it's I'm still working with Ann Schwartz.
You are. All these years, you're still doing that. Wow, that's
Right, I have
wonderful.
other editors along the way, but she and I are still tight, right? So
Well, well, the other thing I noticed is you go back and forth between genres. Sometimes you're writing children's books, sometimes you're writing maybe middle school or young adult books. Is it hard to switch back and forth between genres?
for me, it's the perfect balance. Um, when I'm writing a big project like the Enigma Girls, when I'm writing a big project like that requires not only a lot of research, but a lot of thinking about what that research actually means, at least to me or to my readers. Um, Trying to find the story within all that information. I really need a little time just for me, right? And so that's when I'll write a picture book. Maybe I'll write a little rhyming picture book for preschoolers. I know I've been working on a book about, believe it or not, Jonestown. And in the midst of all of that, I've written a couple of books for very young kids and fiction to boot. So for me, it's a really good balance. It kind of keeps me in the game without burning out.
Well, then, if we're looking at the Enigma Girls, where would you place it on the genre of books? Is it a young adult book? Is it a middle school book? Is it an adult book?
It's it's definitely, I would say, YA, but I'm going to include certainly 6th, 7th, and 8th graders can read this book as well as high schoolers. Yeah, that's where I would put it.
Well, you teach them through this book a lot of very fascinating things, which we hope inspire kids and to strive for their best. But as a 70-year-old man who sort of loves history, I found out so much about history in your book that I was amazed. I just thinking anybody can pick this book up from, like you said, 6th grade to 70 years old and get a lot out of it. It's just wonderful. Just did a great job.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And yeah, I think adults will read it. I think adults will discover a lot in the telling of this story. Who was the guy that was the Jeopardy champion who said that most of the things he learned, he actually went to books written for young readers because they provided context and explanations that adult books did not.
Well, like I said, that it teaches us a lot, and it teaches us in a simple, easy manner that's not the dread academic writing, which is so dense that you can't even make your way through the first chapter. This just flows so beautifully, and again, I think that makes it good for any reader because I think I did it in 2 days. I just loved it. So, as we talk about your book, would you have maybe a little selection from the book you might be able to read for us today?
I do. I marked a little selection for you. So, something suspicious was going on at the St. Leonard's Hotel. A dozen young women, mostly in their late teens and early 20s, had moved into the cliffside building on the outskirt of Wintersmee and completely taken it over. Sometimes the local in this tiny coastal village caught a glimpse of the young women riding their bicycles or sunbathing on the beach, but most of the time they stuck close to the hotel. Obviously, they lived and worked there. Even more suspicious was the forest of tall radio antennas that sprouted up alongside the hotel. The villagers speculated. It was all very curious. Few of them, however, guessed the truth. The St. Leonard's Hotel had been converted into a secret listening station, and the teenagers were eavesdropping on the enemy. One of those secret listeners was 18-year-old Patricia Outram. Her ears clamped in headphones, she sat before her wireless radio equipment. The glow from its illuminated dials cast a golden hue onto her face as she listened to the airwaves' hissing static. With the right hand, she slowly turned the big dial at the radio's center, back and forth, searching. Sometimes she would make out distant and fleeting voices. More often, though, she heard the dots and dashes of Morse code.
That's very good. A solitary thing to sit there and listen to those with those headphones on.
A solitary thing, and often in the middle of the night. Mm-hmm.
Now, friends, as I may have told you this in the introduction, this is a nonfiction book. Okay, Candice has written a nonfiction book here. So when we talk about, she gave a lady's name, a young girl's name, as a matter of fact. This is a real person. Now that gets me to ask the question: what prompted you to write a book about World War II and then the Enigma Girls? Was there something that was an inspiration for you?
Sure. I went to Bletchley Park as a tourist, right? And learned a lot. Was fascinated by Bletchley Park. Knew a little bit about it, but certainly left knowing a lot more. But it wasn't until the very end of the visit at Bletchley Park, they had on one of the walls, they have murals or graphs, I should say, of things like how many meals were served, each day at Bletchley Park for the 9,000 people that ultimately ended up at Bletchley Park. How many of that 9,000 were women, how many were men, and what their ages were. And when I stood there and looked at it first, I thought, wow, look at how many more women there were at Bletchley than there were men. But then when I looked at the women, suddenly I realized that the bulk of them were between the ages, believe it or not, some were as young as 14, between the ages of 14 and 20 when they first turned up at Bletchley Park, which made me think about my own kids when they were teenagers and girls that I know now that are in that age range. And I just thought there was probably an important story to tell, or if not important, at least a good story to tell. And so that's sort of where I began doing the research. It launched me into that research.
It is not just a good story; it is an important story. I think it's an extremely important story because these girls were so integral in saying that we couldn't have won the war, and when we did, we might be able to win it a few years later, but this certainly hastened things along. Now, you mentioned their ages, but was there a particular background or aptitude that any of these girls had that made them come to Bletchley? They were selected?
Early on at Bletchley in 1939, 1940, even a little bit into 41, Bletchley Park enlisted girls that were from those upper crust families because they believed that those were the most trustworthy families in the British Empire, that they would be able to keep those secrets that needed to be kept at Bletchley. But as it became less of sort of a scattershot way of breaking codes and ciphers, mostly ciphers, Bletchley became basically, by the end of its time, a cipher breaking factory, right? So they needed more and more girls. So some girls, they looked for some girls who were good at doing puzzles. They looked, or crossword puzzles, jigsaw puzzle. They looked for girls who were young. They wanted young girls because they knew that these were jobs that were going to take a lot of energy, a lot of unflagging enthusiasm, right? They looked for girls that were a certain height because those girls needed to be tall to run the bomb machines. They looked for girls with mechanical aptitudes. So they would, with those girls running Colossus, they would need to do a lot of adjusting of the machine itself. And they looked for, obviously, girls with some language skills, girls that knew German, girls that knew Italian. So those were sort of the things that they were looking for, along with this overarching idea that these girls would be able to keep a secret.
Now, there may be some people out there in the listening audience who don't know what an Enigma machine is. Can you tell us what is the Enigma?
Oh, the Enigma. It was the Germans' way of sending messages um across vast, fields. I mean, thousands of miles they could send them. What happened was German high command every day would have set a key for the Enigma. And then those who were Enigma operators across, let's just use Europe, across Europe, would then set their key for that day. And then when they sent messages, the key would allow them to encipher. And the machine was an enciphering machine. So it had um, it looked much like our computer keyboard or a typewriter keyboard. It didn't have numbers or punctuation, but it had letters of the alphabet. And so if the um, message was, go now, the Enigma operator would push the G on the Enigma keyboard. But then behind it was a light up board and a different letter would light up like M, and then they would transpose M. Then you would say O, right, for go. And the different letters, say Z, would pop up. So MZ would be the cipher for go, for the word go. And then they would then translate that into Morse code and send it on across where it would be received by another operator who had an Enigma machine and that day's settings. And then he would type in MZ and it would come up on the light board behind it, GO. So that's basically in a nutshell.
Once we get these girls to Bletchley Park, we hear something about the Official Secrets Act. What is the Official Secrets Act?
Everybody at Bletchley Park had to sign, men and women had to sign the Official Secrets Act. And it didn't matter what you were doing at Bletchley. It didn't matter if you were actually breaking ciphers or if you were just a cook making food. And I shouldn't say just because everyone loves to eat, but if you were a cook at Bletchley Park and you weren't actually in the cipher breaking business, everybody had to sign the Official Secrets Act. And the Official Secret Act said that you were not allowed to talk about your work at Bletchley Park at all. So you couldn't talk about it in your letters home to your parents. You couldn't talk about it with your roommate that you might be billeting with. You couldn't talk about it even with your coworkers. So the woman that you might be sitting next to, if you're working a TypeX machine, the woman who's typing next to you, you did not talk about the work that you were doing. So they were not allowed to talk about it then, but they were not allowed to talk about it for the Official Secrets Act for the rest of their lives. This is what they signed. So when those women left Bletchley Park with the experiences that they now had, they were not allowed to tell people what they had done. They couldn't tell their children or their grandchildren. They couldn't talk to their husbands about it. One story I ran across, both husband and wife had both worked at Bletchley Park. They had met at Bletchley Park. They got married while they both worked at Bletchley Park. And do you know that they never talked about Bletchley Park even after they left? 30 years into their marriage, and neither of them talked about what they did at Bletchley Park. One of my favorite stories is Sarah Norton, who was from the upper crust of British society. And one of my favorite stories is they would get passes. They would actually take the train into London for a fun night out before, as she always said, she took the milk train, which means she took the 2 a.m. train back to Bletchley from London, and often turned up in an evening gown to go to work. I love that, right? I'm so late for work. I can't have time to change. I come in my evening gown. But everyone would talk about all the exciting things they were doing in the war. It was really common. So some of her friends would say, oh, I'm driving an American general around England. And somebody else would say, oh, I'm working in the Admiralty and doing whatever. And Sarah knew she couldn't tell them a thing about it. She couldn't even tell them that she was at Bletchley, in Bletchley. So she would purposely make up the most boring stories about filing and file drawers. And then she would go on and on and on, purposely boring her friends to death, so that soon it got around that nobody should ever ask Sarah what she did in the war because she was so dull, and it solved her problem.
That's a wonderful story. I love that. That's very, very good. Very ingenious for that young lady. My word. But, and this is not in your book, but I ask you this question. Do you think today's teenagers could do this? Do you think they can live without social media, without their phones?
It's a little bit like comparing, apples to bread, sort of, because our teenagers have grown up with phones and social media. Um, but I think they could. I think about teenagers are my readers. I trust them implicitly. They're clever and they're smart. And they do have a sense of what's important in the world. Um, and if they were facing the same um, peril that these girls' country was facing, I really believe that they would get down there and they would do that work that was required. And they would do, if they had to stay silent about it, I do believe they would stay silent about it.
Right. Okay, good. I like to hear that optimism. That's good. Now, one of the girls who you follow, again, she worked at Section Y, but she was not even near Bletchley. Where was she located?
Well, she's the one I just read the little bit about, Patricia. She moved around a lot. She was far from Bletchley and far from London, in a couple of different locations. We had Y stations all across the world. In fact, we had Y stations in well, for a while, Singapore, until the Japanese took it. But those places that far away. She stayed in Britain and she went to a couple of remote areas. Her last station was right on the channel, pretty much. Well, she could actually see the guys when they headed toward Normandy on June 6th of 44. So she was at Y Station, and her job, as you heard when I read, was to literally, and it's just so astonishing to me that she would listen to the static of the airwaves, and suddenly she would hear dot, 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 dash, right? Morse code. And then she would know that this was, first she would hear this sort of whooshing sound, a whistling whooshing sound. And she knew that somebody with Enigma was coming online. And then she would listen for the Morse code. And then she would quickly, not only kind of grab that out of the air, but then she would translate that Morse code into letters, put it onto a sheet, rip that sheet off, grab another one, do it again and again and again for 8-hour shifts. She never knew where those translated Morse codes were going. Of course, they didn't make any sense because they were still enciphered, right? So go was still MZ. And she never knew that she was actually part of breaking Enigma, and never knew that until the 1980s because of the Secret Act.
Well, now, also, she got whooshing sounds, she got dots and dashes, but I heard she also got something called ghost voices. What are ghost voices?
So sometimes the Germans would actually talk to them instead of enciphering, right? There would be occasionally you would get a radio operator that would whisper to them, and usually nasty things like, you're going to lose the war, we're going to bomb you tonight, that sort of things. And Patricia said that they were unbelievably creepy, that it was sort of this, you think about it, she worked a lot of night shifts too. And you think about how isolated they were physically. Those Y stations are far from civilization because they didn't want people to know what they were doing. But additionally, then you think about how isolating it is to just sit there in the dark in front of this radio with your earphones on. You're just completely isolated, right? And you're listening for those dots and dashes. And suddenly out of that sort of staticky mist that you're constantly hearing comes this voice. And she said it was unbelievably hair-raising.
That's interesting. Now, one of the things that fascinated me the most is, when they selected these girls, they didn't say, oh, we're going to go to Bletchley Park. No, they didn't tell them where they were going. How, that's amazing that they did, sort of like blind faith, and they put it in. And how did this all work out? I mean, I just am amazed that they would just go like that. And they couldn't tell their parents where they were going.
I found that one of the most amazing parts of the story. So let's think about one of the girls that I follow, Jane Hughes. She, her parents, this is early in the war still, it's 1940. Her parents are still thinking she's going to come out and do the debutante ball thing, all of that. And Jane doesn't really want to do that. She knows that that's, her job there is to find a husband, and it's not something Jane really wants to do. So she's thinking about the kind of war work that she might be able to do that her parents would find appropriate, right? She's, again, upper crust. Um, and she gets invited to Bletchley by an old school friend. She goes for a visit, has no idea what they're doing, but they basically give her a job. She's one of the girls that they give a job to because they believe that her family is trustworthy. One of the things that Bletchley officials did, at least early on in the war, was that they would ask girls that were already at Bletchley what other young ladies they knew that might be appropriate for this job, who could hold their tongues, right? So Jane goes and she accepts a job that she doesn't even know what she's getting. And she goes home and she tells her parents that she's going to this place. She can't tell them where. She says she's going to do war work, but she can't tell them what. And she says to them she will come and see them. She's occasionally allowed a pass so she can return to London to visit them, but she doesn't know when. And then she says, you can write to me, but you have to write to me at a post office box. So her parents, if that was my 17-year-old daughter, I would have been freaked out. There was no way she would have gone anywhere, right? But these were parents that, again, were facing, they understood the absolute peril, the danger that they were facing. And they also understood the importance of defeating Hitler, the importance for the world and for democracy. And so they really, really did take a leap of faith along with their daughters. Sarah Norton, she actually just got a letter in the mail. Somebody had recommended her to the Foreign Service, and she literally gets a letter in the mail that says, you are to report to Bletchley Park on such and such a date, on such and such a time. And they don't tell her what she's going to do, and they don't even meet her at the station. She tells this wonderful story about how she's going to go. She has to go. The Foreign Service has told her to report. Her parents don't know where she's going either. And she's so unsure, what job am I going to do? What will I be doing? And she spends a lot of time packing, which is so 17, right? So remember, they are teenagers. She doesn't know what she's going to wear. She finally ends up taking 5-day dresses and one evening gown. That's the one that does turn to work in an evening gown. One evening gown because she doesn't know exactly what entertainment there might be. And then she takes along with her lipstick and that sort of thing, she takes a record player, all of her phonograph, all of her records, and then her teddy bear. So you think about this a minute. This is a teenager who still wants to have her teddy bear with her, who's still worried about her wardrobe, but is going off to do war work, and she doesn't know what it is. And all she knows is that she's getting off the Bletchley station and is to follow the path to Bletchley Park. And that's all she knows. So the leap of faith they all took was amazing, I think.
Now, of these 10 girls that you followed, did any of them know each other prior to Bletchley? And did they know each other after Bletchley?
The only one that knew someone was Jane Hughes, who came early and was recommended by a school friend who also worked at Bletchley. The other girls, Sarah Norton actually knew her friend Jean because they were both girls in the same social circles. But the other girls did not. They went in not knowing a soul. And it was hard to make friends at Bletchley because you couldn't talk about the one commonality that you all had was being here at Bletchley, away from your families. And yet you could not talk about that. So it made, as Jane Hughes remarked, it made very isolating. There was no one, at least, to talk to about how you were feeling emotionally. You were really, really left alone with that. Because if you wanted to talk about home and how you were feeling missing your family, that meant you had to bring up Bletchley Park. And that was a violation of the Secrets Act. And so, they couldn't even really work that out. And I think about teenage girls. I was a teenage girl once. And I think about teenagers that I know now. They all talk, right? They talk about everything. Oh, they talk about, cute guys that they see. And I know that my girls saw cute men at Bletchley Park. They couldn't talk about it. So it must have been unbelievably difficult, right? They're all their natural inclinations. Yeah, all those natural inclinations as teenagers were suffocated.
Mm-hmm. Well, that brings us back to the Official Secrets Act, and you have a very interesting part of this book where you tell about two girls who are starting to have a verbal altercation at lunch. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's two young ladies. They have gone to lunch. They're in the cafe and the little cafeteria that Bletchley had. And of course, they're sitting together and they know each other, although they work in separate huts. And here's the thing, Bletchley Park had all these divisions, huts and buildings that they built, and girls worked in different huts, and each hut dealt with a different part, mostly of the Nazi war machine. You have some that were working on Italian naval or German naval, some that were working on German Air Force. And they were at lunch, and for whatever reason, they completely erupt. And I think it's simply because it's hard to hold secrets like that in every single day. And so these two young women, think of them as 17-year-olds, are sitting there having lunch, and they suddenly erupt into this very loud argument. And pretty soon it moves to what they're working on. And one of them says, well, in hut 3, we did whatever. And then the other one says, well, in hut 6, we broke the naval or the air codes first before. And then everybody stops. Jane Hughes told us this story, that everybody in that cafeteria stops. Total silence, because they just have crossed the line. They have broken the Secrets Act. And although it's not a very big deal, right? If you think about what they had said. And in fact, the girls don't really know much about what's going on in their own huts, because everybody has their own little piece of the factory and they don't know the rest of the pieces. It's a big deal. So everybody gets super quiet. The girls freak out because they realize that they too have crossed a line. Everybody shuffles back to their work. These girls happen to be in hut 6. And suddenly the supervisor comes out with 2 military policemen and tell them to gather up their things. They're gone. And the girls plead to be allowed to stay, but their supervisor is like, no. And you are so lucky, she tells them, that you are not getting any worse punishment than being asked to leave, because the Secrets Act, they could have put you in jail. You could have been shot. Seriously. That's what the Secrets Act said. And so the girls left tearfully. And then, since this was done in front of all the other Type X women, the supervisor then says to them, let this be a lesson to you, right? Let this be a lesson. We have to stay silent. So Jane at least found that an unbelievable. She was already pretty gloomy because she didn't have anyone to share fears and worries of her experiences at Bletchley Park with. And she just found that hard to take. She thought that was even more gloom in her days.
I can imagine. Now, one of the things that I found, again, fascinating, there's so much friends in this book that's fascinating. She gives these little stories and little things, but you at one point say that there are 8 steps in order to decode a message, if I'm not mistaken. What? Now, I didn't know that. What are these 8 steps that you have to go through?
Yeah, basically the 8 steps. And you know what? I have to refer to my own book because I can't remember the steps myself in order, because they kind of go back and forth. The first one, of course, is what Patricia did. That first step, well, let's go all the way back. The first step is we need a German Enigma operator to send an enciphered code, the enciphered message. And that message enciphered is picked up by the girls at Y Station. There were men at Y Station as well. But again, many of them women with good hearing, young, energetic, right? Is picked up by a girl like Patricia, who then grabs that Morse code out of the air, translates it into regular English, and then those messages are passed on to Bletchley Park. And then the first thing that happens is that people like what they referred to as the boffins, they were mostly men who had a lot of cryptology, they knew a lot about cryptology. And one of my girls, Lever Beatty, who also is breaking ciphers at this point, they work mostly by hand until we get the bombs, by hand to break that code, to break that day's cipher for that particular part of the German military, right? So there are a lot of enigmas out there, right? So if you're working Brown Enigma, you're working the Air Force Enigma. They break the key for that day, and then they hand all the messages. Once the key is broken, they hand all those messages to a bunch of girls who are in the Type X machine, dozens of girls, who then take that, set their Type X machines to the very same key that the Germans had given that morning, and begin to type. And so everything comes out now in German, right? Those deciphered messages then go to translators who will translate the German into English. They also will go to indexers who will file all of that information away by hand. It was astonishing that Bletchley Park had this voluminous index where they kept information to help them break codes as well. But it would be all indexed. But additionally, then that deciphered message would then be sent to somebody in British command for the intelligence, because it's now intelligence, to be sent to the places that they most think it would be necessary, the Admiralty or Churchill or whoever. And then from there, those people in the British government and the British military would then decide which generals needed that intelligence the most. Sometimes they didn't believe the intelligence. Early on, they didn't believe it, but they quickly came to learn that Bletchley was unbelievably dependable.
And this is going on 24 hours a day.
24 hours a day. And amazingly, Bletchley Park gets better and better at breaking those daily keys. We have Alan Turing creating the bomb, which can break them in like record time. Think about it as compared to what you were doing by hand. You now have basically a calculating machine to help break those keys. So they are breaking them. They become unbelievably good at it. And they are pretty much everything that's sent by Enigma will be broken by Bletchley Park. By January of 44, D-Day, Bletchley Park is breaking and sending intelligence within 30 minutes of receiving then of having been picked up by Way Station. They're doing that within 30 minutes. So, and the best is Germans never knew. They thought the Enigma was completely infallible. It was completely impossible to break. And so they never knew that they were being listened to.
Well, see, this is where I always say you taught me so much, because I never realized that, first of all, each branch of the German military had their own separate Enigma machine and code.
Yeah.
And then how they
Separate
kept
key.
right, and then more wheels and more cogs, and they kept getting more and more. I never realized the extent of this. And these young ladies were doing so much work. It was amazing.
And they came in, I think of it sort of when I would read what they would do, I think to myself, wow, that is some really slogging, grinding work that they're doing. And they're doing it 8, 12 hours a day. And they're doing it every single day. I think the girls that ran the bomb machines, the girl I follow, Diana Payne, she hated them. There's no other word. She hated the bomb machines.
She
She
hated the computer,
hated
huh?
the noise. Yeah, it was more like a calculator. The Colossus was definitely pre-computer, but bomb was sort of a very advanced calculator, right? It could move through the possibilities a whole lot faster. Um, but she hated it. It was loud. It broke down a lot. She had to oil it, so her hands, she was always dripping oil. It was dirty. She was always reaching in with those little brushes to keep the wires. They were very persnickety little machines or big machines, and she hated every minute of it. And yet she goes every single day. She works with that machine every single day. She calls them the monsters, the mechanical monsters. She doesn't have much nice to say about them. But she does such a great job that she actually moves up from just running the machine to supervising several machines. And you know, that's dedication, that's perseverance. She does that for the entire war until the war ends. And then right after um, right after Germany surrenders, they are VE Day. Almost immediately afterwards, the girls are asked to take apart the bomb machines, so that no one will ever know what they were doing there at Bletchley Park. And she relishes taking apart those machines and dropping things floor. She loved being able to drop bits and pieces on the floor because that was such a no-no, right? Prior to it, they were so precious. And now I'm just going to take this screw and drop it on the floor. How fun, but she's still young, right?
Bletchley Park. For some reason, I read Bletchley Park, and I feel like I'm at stately Wayne Manor in Batman. I don't know why I'm in this,
It
but
is. Well,
eh,
it is. That's exactly it. It's an estate.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But
Somebody's
I always thought people just stayed in the manor, but no, they had all these, I guess, buildings, huts. What? How do they house everybody there?
Right. It began with just a handful of people, and they did stay in the manor. And pretty quickly, they discovered they were going to need more space, and so they built what they called huts, like in the places like would have been in the Rose Garden and whatever. They built huts, and then they built more huts, and then when they realized the huts weren't going to cut it, they built buildings, right? Real buildings. And as the number of people at Bletchley grew from a handful of people to 9,000. But none of them actually slept on the grounds unless you were staying overnight because you couldn't leave if something top secret was happening, like June 6th, or you were breaking code overnight, like Mavis Lever often did. But most of them actually were billeted in other places. So you would actually have a director of housing from Bletchley that would go around the countryside and the town of Bletchley and neighboring towns, searching for places for those young men and women to live. And they would pay them to take this boarder in. And some of those places, some of those billets, as they were called, were really terrific. And others of them were not. And the stories of the girls, I mean, think about this too. So we're going to put a 17-year-old with a family, and we have no idea who this family actually is. Some of the girls ended up in places that were completely different from any place they had ever lived. I think about Jane Hughes. Her first billet was with a family. She worked the nights, and the family was up, and children were screaming all day long. And she had an outdoor toilet and food that she'd never eaten before. And she actually went in search of her own billet, right? But so they actually had citizens, regular citizens taking them in. And this is common. Citizens could not say no to the military. If the military needed them to take a person or two in, they would. Um, Eventually, when we started having bunches of women from like the WAFs and the Wrens turn up, so we're using women from the military services. They would build barracks for them, or they would house them in big old country estates that were not particularly close to Bletchley Park. So now we have a bus service. Used to be women were walking and bicycling to the estate. And now we have buses and trucks picking up these young women, or some of them are taking a short train ride to Bletchley to come to work. So they're getting farther and farther away from the estate as well. So that added to their days, right? If they had to wait for the bus.
What did they do for recreation? Did they have any recreation at Bletchley?
Oh gosh, they had lots of recreation. Bletchley Park actually had, in the manor, after no one's staying in it, they had what they considered their library and record room. So you could go into the library and record room and check out books. You could play records. They also played baseball and, well, not baseball, I guess. I guess they're playing cricket. Sorry. They're playing cricket. They had some clubs. They had a drama club. So they would actually put on plays for people at Bletchley Park. Sometimes they had performers come in and perform for them. A lot of them bicycled on their days off or their hours off. They bicycled around the countryside. Um, they did a lot of activities like that. They went to town, went to the movies, went to the pubs, took the train to London, if that was possible. Like Sarah often went overnight. Sometimes they got passes and they went home. So they did, at least at Bletchley, they did a lot of things to entertain themselves. And I find that really fascinating too, that you could have a dance. Oh, when the Americans came, they would invite them to the Americans would throw dances, and the people, mostly girls at Bletchley Park, would be invited. And that was very exciting. The girls would say that they loved to go to the Americans' dances because they had things like Hershey bars, and they actually had stuff that the Brits hadn't seen in a very long time. So that's what they did for entertainment. I always feel bad for people like the Wrens when I was doing my research. So Diana Payne and the Wrens, who are running bombs, a lot of those were no longer run. At first, they were run at Bletchley Park, but later on, they were done at outstations, several outstations away from Bletchley Park. And they really were confined to their outstations. So they really had less entertainment and less fun than the girls at Bletchley Park.
Being Italian, I am particularly distressed at the fact that these young ladies were single-handedly basically able to destroy the entire Italian naval fleet. This is unbelievable.
And pretty early.
Yes. And I put the Italians out of the war for that. What happened there? Tell us a bit about that.
Oh, there was one of the girls that I follow, her name, Mavis Beatty, eventually, because she actually met her husband, a fellow cipher breaker at Bletchley Park. She is working for Dilly Knox, which was he was an extraordinary cryptographer and had worked during World War I as well. And he had these sort of odd ways of doing things, but he chose the girls based on their ability to do jigsaw puzzles, crossword puzzles, or language skills. And he had his own separate, they called it the cottage. It's really the stables at Bletchley Park, which is where they did their work. And Mavis is early on in her career there. She's at night as she's going through messages, encryption. She's going through ciphered messages that are still in cipher. They have been unbreakable. And she's working all these ways that Dilly Knox has taught her. He always is like, look at it backwards, look at it inside out, look at it like a clock from the other side. If you're the clock, where are the hands? They're on the opposite side of the clock. And she's doing her thing. And suddenly, up out of what she refers to as gibberish, she actually wrote that out of this gibberish, there floats this message. And it says X-3. And they at the cottage are actually working on Italian naval ciphers. So the Italians are using Enigma too. Um, she's working on Italian ciphers, Italian Navy ciphers, and suddenly this message floats up. And she knows that X-3 means something is going to happen in 3 days, but they do not know what. And so now the whole team is back. They work overnight. They try to figure out what is going to happen in X-3, and then it's X-2, and then it's X-1. And at the very last minute, they actually get a huge message, not a short message, but a huge message, which were for them easier to decipher because there was more to work with. And so what does she do? They all in the team, including Dilly Knox, they all take a part of this message and they all work their bits to decipher it. And they realize they've got war plans for this huge invasion, that this huge thing that the Italian Navy is going to undertake. And so they sent it to Admiral Cunningham. So they have it. They break it. And Mavis tells this story about it's pouring rain, and she literally runs, because we are X-1 now, right? Runs through the rain, runs to the commander's office, races in breathless and soaking wet with this deciphered plan of the Italian Navy. And they send it on quickly to Admiral Cunningham, and it is, of course, the Battle of Matapan, which basically puts the Italian Navy out of commission for the rest of the war. And this is 1941.
All 5 boats in the Italian Navy. Unbelievable.
All
Unbelievable.
5, yeah.
All 5. Oh, my word. Oh, my word.
My favorite stuff is that Admiral Cunningham knew what they had done. And so afterwards, he came to thank them. Now, these are all teenage girls. So he came to thank them. And they actually shake his hand and they're thrilled to meet him, but they're teenagers. So they play a prank on him. And the inside of their cottage had just been whitewashed and it was still wet. And he came with this wonderfully neat and tidy, dark uniform. And they encouraged him to lean against the wall. And when he left, he had this white stripe down the back of his suit. And they all giggled and thought they had, literally skunked the admiral. Only teenagers, right?
That's what they
So
teenage
they saved
girls,
the day. Right. He destroyed the Italian army and then pranked the admiral who did it. Yeah.
I have got so many questions yet to go, but I mean, we're coming in on the 1 hour mark, if you can believe this. But one of the things I'd want to ask before we get going here is the research. Where did you find all the research, and how did you mentioned people's names and what they said or did. So what happened with the Official Secrets Act as time went on, and where did you get all your research from?
Eventually, one of the men who was high in the structure of Bletchley Park broke the Secrets Act, and he wrote a book. And immediately after that, Diana Payne, the one that was running the bombs and hating them, decided that it was time that she was going to tell her own story too. So she wrote an article, and that sort of opened the floodgates. Everybody kind of stood around and were like, oh, first, really, we could talk now? Are you sure? And I know Mavis Beatty wrote that it was so amazing to finally be able to explain to her children why she was so good at puzzles and anagrams, but she could never tell anybody what she'd actually done. Some of the young women who are now old women at this time realized for the first time what it was they were doing. And I think that's shocking. It's the 1980s. And for the first time, some of these women, like Joanna, who ran Colossus, never understood that she was actually breaking Enigma codes. In fact, many of them never even heard the word Enigma. And so they finally felt free to tell their stories. At the same time, the British government, which had gathered up all those records from Bletchley Park and had kept them top secret, actually dumped the records, mountains of records. So you can actually look at those records yourself. Some of them are online, some of them are not, but you can actually go to see them in archives. in Britain. Lot of the young women wrote their stories as an opportunity to finally tell what they had done. So many of them wrote their memoirs. Many of them were self-published, so I sort of had to hunt those down. Bletchley Park did a project in the 90s where they took affidavits and stories. They actually recorded different women telling what they had done at Bletchley Park, men and women, what they had done at Bletchley Park. So there were a lot of firsthand primary source material, a lot of stories that were told. And they told them with such amazing details. And it's so really fun when you can actually hear their voices in some of those tape recordings where they laugh and they tell you what was wonderful about it and what was awful about it. And, you know, so their stories are the ones that I told. And when I say they told me, I know I do that a lot. Mavis told me, but she really did because I listened to her story. Yeah.
Before we go, I have to ask you this question. What's next for Candice Fleming? What are you working on? Are we doing children's, middle school? What are we doing? What books are coming up?
A little bit of Blaine, a little bit of everything, right? Okay, so I have a picture book coming. It's actually called Narwhal. It comes in the fall. And that's for your younger readers, right? But I also have a young adult book, and it is definitely not in this case, unlike Enigma Girls, which is for 6th and 7th. 6th and 7th graders can certainly read it. I wouldn't give this one to 6th or 7th graders. It's called Death in the Jungle, and it's actually about People's Temple and Jonestown. Follows teenagers that were part of People's Temple and ended up in Jonestown. It's lengthy, and it was, believe it or not, it was a fabulous project. I got to meet and got to know people like Stephen Jones, Jim Jones's son, who was 18 at the time. And so that's coming up. And then I'm going to do a book about wildlife, about poaching. It's wildlife crime, true crime, and takes place in South Africa.
Wow. Well, I'll tell you, there's a lot of things you got coming up. It's going to be interesting. And I'll tell you what, you do a service, because a lot of these stories that you tell are not taught to our kids, are not taught in our history books. And if it wouldn't be for people like you who are writing these stories, readable stories, enjoyable stories, which you're teaching us something, so much would go unknown. And so hats off to you. Hats off. And by the way, thank you so very much for taking time from your day to spend it here with us here at Books and Looks.
Thank you, Blaine. It was a pleasure.
Well, thank you again, Candice, for a wonderful interview and writing a really informative book. I hope all of you go out there and get the book, read the book, do whatever you can to get this book. You'll learn a lot about these young ladies who helped break the German codes in World War II. Now, what am I looking at? Okay, I'm looking at hot dogs. That's right, I'm looking at hot dogs. What about you? I'm looking at hot dogs because Joey Chestnut, that's right, Joey Chestnut, the world's hot dog eating champion, will no longer be participating at the Nathan's famous hot dog eating contest on the 4th of July. This is devastating. I mean, Joey Chestnut holds the world record for eating something like 70-some hot dogs in 10 minutes. That's with the bun. Oy vey. But neither is the other guy, the Japanese gentleman, Kobayashi. He's not going to be there either. What's left? I don't know. But will there be hot dogs at all? I'll tell you what. I'm going to do some digging on this, because you know what? My kids, my daughter Sarah, my son Nathaniel, are going to be up in New York, and they're going to that contest. That's right. They will be there on the 4th of July. Look for them on ESPN. But I want to hear the reports on who are the new people, who's coming up, what looks good, what looks bad about hot dogs. But I'm thinking all things hot dogs. You know what? If I eat 2, I feel full. I can't imagine eating 50, 60, 70 hot dogs. Ay, ay, ay. Anyway, hey, listen, hot dogs. Oh, my, oh, my. Anyway, on behalf of viewsonbooks.com, on behalf of my good friends at Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks, saying may all your leaves be pages in a book.